there's been a strategy of coaxing people towards yes, because there isn't, let's face it, a very high level of state consent to break away. People aren't, it's not the Irish situation, people won't wear higher taxes just to be independent of England. So at least not enough people will to create the grounds for yes. It's been a coaxing strategy. Now, coaxing strategy is all very well, and it's actually done a good deal for the yes vote, but it has left the agenda open to the no campaign. I think no campaign has been structurally more successful. You know, it was said that the currency issue when it was first raised was a mistake. I mean, there was initial real reaction to it, but their longer-term strategic view was probably correct, that it was a serious destabilising element. It was a serious destabilising element. And senior people I've talked to in the SNP lament, I think, the lack of attack. The lack of attack about the risks of voting no, the lack of focus on the austerity agenda after 2015-16, the lack of downside in a no vote, which has really escaped. I mean, of course, the way in which the whole debate is framed doesn't always help, but that has escaped scrutiny in this kind of gentle push towards the positive message of yes, and the positive towards beating the negative. I mean, I think that's correct. Positive does beat the negative, but when you've got such a very, very negative campaign, you have to ask them what their positives are, a bit more sharply than maybe it has always been done.
Mm. I mean, as you say, there are many downsides to the union, but what seems to be missing at the moment is what may happen after a no vote. I mean, I think it's even Andrew Neil who said that, I mean, all the stuff that you've had in Scotland, you know, the Holyrood Parliament, even things like the Calman Commission, etc., when you think about it, is all generated by the SNP and its success, not directly, but in reaction to the electoral success of the SNP. If the Scots, give back that power, to the threat, if you like, of independence, all of that power dissipates. And I mean, it just leaves Scotland open to whatever Westminster decides to do. And the way it's shaping up at Westminster should be sounding alarm bells. The rise of UKIP, the possibility of Boris Johnson being the next Tory leader.
All those things are absolutely right. I think that on the day of the debate, the letter that appeared from all the UK and Scottish Unionist Party leaders gave an unequivocal commitment to powers of the Scottish Parliament. And what it gave an unequivocal commitment to was vaguer, more uncosted, and with fewer obvious advantages than anything that the Yes campaign's been criticised on. Again, I think they've been pressed on it, but in a sense they still have been let off lightly. There is very little credibility for the more powers option. There's dissent between the parties, and quite honestly, whenever Scottish legislation goes to Westminster, it happened in the Scotland Act, it happened with Calman in the 2012 Scotland Act, it gets dissipated, it gets diluted, it gets chipped away at. What have we got here? We got housing benefits so that a future Labour government in Holyrood can blame SNP local authorities, and future Labour local authorities can resist an SNP government in Holyrood. And we've got some fragments of tax powers where you can only raise taxes but you can't possibly lower them. In other words, yet another tax power that isn't likely to be used because it's structurally designed, as I think both the 3% variable and the Calman Commission variables aren't likely to be used, because it's structurally geared not to be used, and because the taxes which Scotland over-contributes in, which are many of the indirect excise taxes, don't come back to Scotland, and that's leaving aside the question of an oil fund, which is good enough for Texas and good enough for states in Canada and Australia, but isn't good enough for Scotland.
Yeah, Alberta.
Yes,
deal,
Alberta. Yes, absolutely.
Murray, you said you're an academic. You're in Academics for Yes. I mean, have you always had a belief in independence, and if not, what happened to you?
Well, I'm not sure it's really a road to Damascus moment. I guess the formative thing was I grew up in Aberdeen. And Aberdeen was not a place and I grew up in the camp, left school and went to Glasgow in the run-up to the first devolution referendum. And I think it was the level of debate about that, and particularly the negativity and hostility, which anyone who's of that generation remembers as the No campaign, which denominated the view that I took. I mean, I know Alex Salmon quoted it recently, but that morning of poll, 1st March 79, Daily Express editorial that if you voted yes to devolution, Gartcosh would close, Ravenscraig would close, Scottish industry would be decimated. You know, summed up the negativity towards Scottish autonomy, which has been so full of nonsense throughout the last 35 years and so short on any positive alternatives.
But I mean, that in a one way though, that is a negative. You're reacting to something there. I mean, is there a kind of I don't know what I would call my nationalistic impulse? Is that the same thing that you're describing there? Is it almost like to defend Scotland in some way when you hear those sort of claims that, you know, we can take this from you, we will destroy that, which I actually think is what's happening with the currency. I think that's what they're saying. Is, I mean, if you put this in your manifesto and make a commitment to it, irrespective of the economic implications, that to me is a form of madness. I mean, that should be roundly criticised.
Exactly, but we don't, you know, we don't have the framework to do it in. I mean, one of the reasons that the structural advantage that London gains is the lack of critique that comes from anywhere but the Scottish independence movement for it. But I mean, in terms of motivation, I mean, yeah, sure, there's a national motivation, but also where in a generation which has become more and more international, that preserving Scottish identity has been essentially seen, particularly by the Labour Party, as a localist project. In the sheer success of Scottish food and drink exports after 2007, when they began to be promoted by a national government in national terms rather than, you know, something with a saltire you tucked away in the back of the shelf at Tesco's. You know, that's a signal of what we can do. An international world, if you believe Scotland's a country, you should be able to promote Scotland and define Scotland internationally. And when that's happened, it's very clear there's a huge level of recognition and interest out there. And one of the things that, particularly as I got, you know, more engaged with Scottish studies and became, and I guess I'm a cultural historian, you know, I became increasingly conscious that in the Victorian period, there was more leeway for Scots to actually represent themselves nationally abroad than there is today. The demand for the homogenisation of the British state has been completely unacceptable. And if you get on Eurostar today, you'll welcome the Welcome to Great Britain sections you get on, for example, at Gare du Nord in Paris. There are about 25 images. 24 of those are London, and one of them is a country pub in England. If you go into some of the British Council offices abroad, you'll get Welcome to London's office in whatever city it is. The focus on England and the focus in England on London as a synecdoche for the whole of the British Isles would have been unthinkable in the era of Gladstone, but now it's expected.
Yeah, I saw there was an image on television last night of the Wallace Monument, and there's a great big craggy outcrop, you know, commemorating Wallace. It was built by the Victorians.
Absolutely.
I mean, expressing this sort of profound sense of what we would now regard as almost a ridiculous level of nationalistic pride in a legendary figure about whom there is much mythology, and yet they did that by public subscription and saluted it, and that was all within the Union.
Absolutely, and I mean, you know, we just been finding out in the last project in the last year at Glasgow, there were 3 debates by Glasgow University students in the 1840s and 50s in Gaelic on whether the Union had been a good thing for Scotland or not. Now, you know, if those had happened 30 years ago, they would have been pilloried. But they happened at the height of empire. You know, it's a country, an international state like Great Britain as it was then, was much more at ease with itself. And the desire to cut Scotland off, not to stop the world so Scotland can get on, has been one of the really toxic things of the last 40 years, which has really motivated me towards a yes and seeing Scotland to assume its place in the world.
I also want to ask you, for some people it's surprising. I mean, you're Glasgow University. One of the big characters in this debate has been Adam Tompkins, one of your university colleagues, who completely disagrees with you, diametrically opposed to your view. Is it a surprise that, you know, people who study and who look at facts and research information can come to completely different conclusions? Do you expect that to happen in these circumstances?
Well, I expect that to happen because facts lead you in different directions depending on the facts. First of all, economists always disagree, and they're very fact-oriented, and we have a very clear divide among economic views. But the other thing is lawyers. I mean, lawyers are obviously on both sides of the debate, but there is in law, without reflecting on Adam, who's a terrific lawyer, law looks for certainties. And politics trumps law. And of course, law never wants to think it's being trumped by politics, but ultimately politics trumps law. And so there are, for example, on the EU membership question, there's a straightforward contradiction in the law and the politics. In fact, the law might be said to be much more on Scotland's side, and it's the politics that are providing the tensions. But in the end, politics and law exist symbiotically, and politics trumps law in the end.
I remember over the question of whether Scotland had the power to hold a referendum at all.
Yeah.
Adam was involved in that. And it struck me that you could have a very tight reading of the legislation to say, no, you don't have the power. But when you step back to say, no, hang on, this is a parliament, it has the power to legislate. I mean, it's elected by common suffrage, universal suffrage. And that in itself is a form of referendum. You're asking the public for support. The idea that you, as a legislator, would not be allowed to hold a referendum on anything you wished sounded completely undemocratic. And yet that was the legal argument.
Well, I think precisely so. And the House of Lords report, which argued that there had to be legislation to allow Scotland to negotiate in the aftermath of a referendum, was equally bizarre, because of course there was no such legislation forthcoming to allow the Irish side to negotiate in 1921. Once again, as certainly the British state becomes more focused and smaller, and some of its it's got a very backward rear-view mirror view about its institutions, and it valorises them. The sovereignty of Parliament, which has already come under some significant pressure in legal decisions down south in the last 10 years, not all to do with Scotland by any means, it becomes, for some people, a kind of a ne plus ultra, a holy grail they've got to hold on to. And again, the irony is that a century ago, we wouldn't have, there was more realpolitik. And, realpolitik is a much better way of conducting things, to be quite honest.
Well, we're joined now by Kate Caskie of
Hello.
Women for Independence. Welcome to you.
Hello.
What do you make of that point? Do you think Murray's right? You're going to disagree with him?
Which point specifically? I've been sitting here fascinated listening to the stuff about the Victorians and the sense of Scotland as a nation. There's one thing that struck me was, I don't know if we're still allowed to talk about Alex Salmond or not, but there was a point Alex Salmond made several years ago that's always struck with me, which was he went and read Hansard going back 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And he says, at that time, the Westminster Parliament, debate after debate, was about empire, about running the empire. And he made that, and that always struck with me, that story. His argument was how much smaller Westminster had become, how much less its concerns. It was no longer running an empire, but it kept the pomp of the state. It kept that sense of, dominance, aggression, that was really inappropriate to a state that was no longer running an empire. And that kind of ties in what you were saying. In the days of empire, perhaps, to be Scottish, and you're talking about how the identity of the Scottish nation in Victorian times was not as compromised, perhaps, as it is now. I think that's absolutely fascinating when we look back at these kind of historical issues, I must say. Of course, it behoves me to condemn them all utterly, because of course there wasn't equal representation for women at the time, therefore it was also a masculine empire and a masculine politics. But I do think there's a lot we can learn from our history.
Do you mean there would have been no British Empire had it been run by women?
Oh, I think we'd never have lost the British Empire if it had been run by women.
Oh, dear me.
No, that's a joke.
I think that the thing that's really struck me is that if you look at, say, Scottish associations abroad, and there are many ones which did include women, incidentally, but they were 45 in South Africa alone by the turn of the 20th century. And the Scottish organisations abroad, the Caledonian clubs and societies and so on, they existed to get Scots jobs. I'm not saying it was, nice, equal employment, all the rest of it, but isn't it interesting that an overarching British state was quite happy to allow a vast international network of Scottish preference to exist without challenging it, and actually to get Scots at the expense of English people?
It's almost like if we were just having the Scottish culture, everybody was fine with that, but the minute we wanted a bit of political clout to go with the culture, that was when the hammer started falling.
Is that the difference, Murray? I just wonder, when you say that, why was it different in those days, do you suspect, from what you're suggesting is the case now? Why were they more tolerant of that Scottish idea?
Because the British Empire, Britain is basically an international idea. And the idea that became very prevalent in the 1870s was that that eventually Britain would kind of replicate itself. It's associated with Sir John Seeley's expansion of empire model. There'd be lots of little Britons across the seas, and maybe close to home as well. And so you'd be Canadian and British, Australian and British, and you still get that. I mean, there are people who describe themselves Canadian and British now in identity politics. You still get, or until recently got, the Union flag above Victoria State buildings in British Columbia. So that is that element of the multinational. So if you're one and, that's fine. But after 1945, particularly, you increasingly didn't become one and. You had to be British. And British became more intensely focused on a single univocal national identity because it was defending itself against the collapse of this big international model.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really, it does make perfect sense, doesn't it? But it's quite interesting you're talking about the Caledonian clubs abroad. We've not really talked about them at all during the Indie Ref, and they're still there. And we're all sort of a bit embarrassed by them somehow. I don't know, we're not giving, I mean, maybe that's right, but they are sort of a post-empirical thing lying across in Canada, having Highland Games and
what's wrong with a bit of Highland Games?
I'm a Ouija. I think there's more than one Scottish cultural identity. I think perhaps in those days, the sort of the Walter Scott, the tartan, that sort of invented Scottish identity was there. I think now we're more confident to say there's more than one Scottish identity. There is that sort of Highland identity.
Yeah, I know, but there's like that Highland Games of Mulgai. I mean, it's
Highland, isn't it, Mulgai?
Oh, for goodness sake! See, you really are taking a wee perspective here. But if that sells the brand abroad, that's absolutely fine. And I speak at Burn Suppers abroad quite a lot, and actually one of the things I noticed is the expatriate community in Europe and North America much more likely to be interested in supporting independence than the expatriate community in London, by and large. I'm fine with Burn Suppers and Scottish country dancing and tartan and all that kind of thing, because that is the internationally recognised brand. Doesn't mean that's how we are at home, but Ireland manages to sell plastic leprechauns across the world without actually believing that people in Ireland are plastic leprechauns. You have to be comfortable with what it sells.
You used the word brand there, and I've been thinking for some time, because I try to work out what it is if I were one of those British Scots who are going to vote no. What is it I'm voting for? I mean, I don't believe with my left-right politics that it's about social justice. I don't think that's what Britain represents. The current austerity programme I would be voting against. So, what is it? I don't care which currency I use, so long as it's got value. So what is it? And you come to the conclusion that it seems to be some type of amazingly powerful brand. It's something that people buy into. If you're getting cereal, it's Kellogg's. I don't know, Kit Kat. Something which is just beyond criticism almost. It's just a fact. It is. And if you try to explain it, as bits of corn in a cardboard box, it doesn't work.
There's this sense of, you want independence, you're just being silly. You're just being daft. And I think you see it in its most concentrated form, perhaps, again in Glasgow. I'm Glasgow-centric, where you see that working class orange vote that's still there. Now, that was the working class vote that elected, they say it elected a Conservative majority in Scotland in 1955. But of course, they weren't standing as Conservatives, they stood as Unionists, and that's the point that's often overlooked. And that's still there in small pockets. And it is this sense of, it's madness to vote independence. It's, how dare you even bring it up? And there's a sense of, how dare you even ask me to vote in this? My identity is British. And parts of its roots are still in Orangism, in Glasgow Rangers, obviously a huge institution. And some of these guys are quite scary in how passionate they are about their British identity. I mean, they're the mirror image of the more kilted Cyberman.
Can they explain what that is, though, you see? Can they explain it, about what that Britishness is?
But they're not in the bubble, Derek. They're not in the political... We're talking about people... I mean, everyone sitting around this table is in the political bubble. Most people on Twitter, most people that are really engaged are in the bubble. When you're doing work, and for example, Women for India out in the schemes, you're talking to people who are not in the bubble. You're bringing the debate to them anew. These kind of, the hardcore orange vote, the hardcore British vote, isn't in the bubble. It doesn't care about currency. It doesn't care about austerity. These are people who are British first, British through and through, and they don't understand why they're being asked. They don't understand how that can be even risked. It's almost unthinkable to them. And it's not a sophisticated political argument. It's a real raw sense of identity. It's there. It's still there. It's presumably not as common as it was in 1955. That was the high point of that kind of identity. And the collapse of Presbyterianism in the 60s, I think, changed a lot. But there is still that residual hardcore British vote.
Absolutely. There are 42% of Rangers fans say they're going to vote yes, and the only poll I've seen, I'm not sure how scientific the base was.
No, not all Rangers, many Rangers supporters, but then I don't want to get into the whole whether Rangers are still who Rangers were, but there are many Rangers supporters, the ones who have been uncomfortable with a lot of what's been going on at Rangers in terms of, you know, Ulster politics and things. Reasonable people who are looking at it, but there is still that hardcore, and that's not a
I'm just saying
sophisticated
it's changing.
electorate.
It's changing.
Slowly.
I agree they're still there.